On this edition of the Cameron Joel podcast, we're talking with Amy Edelstein. She's written a memoir, really, about her time in northern India and the kind of spirituality of Tibetan and Buddhist cultures, and her whole travelogue and her whole journey through all of this sort of thing. It's a very interesting conversation. I actually forgot to record about the first 20 minutes of it. So the recording kind of starts in the middle of our conversation. We kind of circle back around everything. But it all works out in the end. And I think it actually ended up being better because we ended up having a deeper conversation than the kind of 20 minutes of pre-production that ended up not being recorded. So the autism was hitting good that day. Is my point. So anyway, this is a fascinating conversation. We're going to take a little journey to northern India. So come with me on this fun journey, and we're just gonna vibe for a little bit. So it's another edition of the Cameron Journal podcast. Let's go. This is the Cameron Journal podcast. It's a place where we talk about important things. It's a place where we bring a little slice of the news to you. It's a place where we do important things, have important conversations. It's also things that I like to talk about. My name is Cameron Cowan, and this is the Cameron Journal podcast. Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, we are joined by Amy Edelstein, who is the author of a new book called Adventure in Zanskar. And we're going to learn about her journey to enlightenment and inner peace and spirituality and all this type of thing. And we're really excited to learn more about this book. Welcome, Amy, to the Cameron Journal podcast.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Yes. So I am looking over this book. I'm really interested in kind of two aspects of this. One is the kind of spiritual, meditative inner aspect of all of this. And then the other is kind of the women's empowerment angle. So let's talk spirituality first. Why don't you give us an idea of how you went on this adventure in Zanskar, and where that is, because we're going to all need an atlas here in a minute, and then why that spiritual journey was important to your life.
Great. I'm happy to start there. And I always like to say that our spiritual journey and our life journey are not two separate things. So for some of your listeners who might not see themselves as spiritual, not even spiritual, but not religious, but not spiritual at all, I often like to remind people that we all have guiding principles and values and signposts that help us turn our lives from a mundane life into something meaningful. And whether that meaning is raising a loving and caring family or innovating a medical, a cure for a virus, a vaccine for coronavirus, or anything in between, we all want to live a life of meaning and purpose. We're not really guided to search for that in our culture. We're guided to have, to pull happiness off the shelf at the grocery store and hope that ice cream or cold cereal or whatever we're drinking is going to do it for us. So our culture doesn't help us look for that meaning and purpose. But when I talk about that aspect that drew me to Zanskar, that set me on this outrageous journey, it really had to do with really wanting my life to matter, wanting it to count, not just by what I did, but by where I was coming from. I went to Asia. I had my 21st birthday, staying in a little hut across a lake that I had to get to by canoe in Western Nepal in Pokhara, where J.R.R. Tolkien spent some time, and a lot of the scenes from The Hobbit reminded me of that place. And after that, I ended up going into North India and spending time in the high mountains in North India, studying different philosophies and with different teachers, different systems, and spending as much time as I could just walking in different parts of the mountains in the 4 northern states of India. Zanskar is this tiny little valley, which is one of the highest valleys in the world. The floor of the valley is 3,000 meters above sea level, which is between 9 and 10,000 feet above sea level. So it's quite high. And it's a little like a desert. It gets very little rainfall. There's snow and glaciers. It's part of the Tibetan Plateau. So in our contemporary world map, it's surrounded by, on the east, Chinese-occupied Tibet, on the south, the major power of India, on the west, Pakistan, and on the north, you have Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and Russia, not quite touching Zanskar, but you can see that this tiny little valley is at the confluence of a lot of conflict and uncertainty. And of course, right now we're living in times of uncertainty, and that uncertainty can mean that very little travel goes in and out. When I went to Zanskar in 1983, the borders had only been open for tourists, or casual travelers for about 7 years. They had been closed for decades. So I was really there at the beginning of when Westerners, I wasn't the first Westerner by a long shot to go to the valley, but I was at the beginning of where it became open to people who wanted to see what life was like there.
Oh,
and I really, go ahead.
No, I was interrupting you. Go ahead.
Oh, I really went there to meet the people, because it's the oldest continuously Buddhist valley in the world. And because I had already lived in Dharamsala, which is where the home of the Tibetan government in exile. So I was familiar with a little bit with Tibetan culture, a little bit. I'd studied Tibetan language with a monk at the Dalai Lama's monastery. And I had done some teachings and retreats with different Tibetan teachers. So I was a little bit familiar, and just everything about the culture spoke to me. I liked that the people were fun-loving, and they're kind of jokesters, they're rowdy, they're forward. The women are very bold and vivacious, and they have their own role, and they're not at all second. And I love the high mountains. So I went there to really see what I could learn from the people, and how I could really sort of immerse myself in what I was learning philosophically and theoretically by being around people who were just steeped in the Buddhist doctrine.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So, what we don't really have this meditative mindfulness tradition in the West as such, in our kind of pre-production. You grew up in Pittsburgh. What do you think is the reason why we don't have such an idea of mindfulness and, Zen, if you will, in the West as they do in the East?
There are a lot of different ways to answer that question. And yeah, there are a lot of different threads to unpack. And I guess one I would say simply is that in the Eastern teachings, even though they use a lot of symbolism, or Hinduism uses a lot of deities, Buddhism, depending on the sect of Buddhism, also uses external symbolism. But they're very clear that the external symbolism really represents qualities of our own mind. And that the emphasis is on really observing the nature of mind, of thought, feeling, sensation, really understanding a deep psychology of mind, and exploring the nature of human awareness or consciousness. What is it? What is that I sense? What's it made of? How do we know that we know? How is knowing or awareness separate from thought or the objects that arise in the field of awareness? And so the emphasis is on, they say, famously, truth is a pathless land. And that means that each sojourner in search of wisdom needs to chart their own course. The Old Testament, of course, was more based on the rule of law, which was needed. There was a lot of sort of a need to corral the tempers of the land and to bring people into a way of abiding peacefully together and to bring in justice. But it was more, the emphasis was more on adhering to an external code and conforming one's behavior, purifying one's behavior, cultivating devotion and obedience, and also wisdom and knowledge, but really in adherence to the rule of law, what was external. And so I think that emphasis, which probably had also to do with what was happening geopolitically, where the Judeo-Christian religions arose, those differences, I think, created more affinity for meditation in the East and less in the West. Although in all the Western traditions, meditation is a part of it. And I think when you brought up Zen, there's an aesthetic to the Far East, and their pursuit of wisdom, truth, beauty, and goodness. And that also has to do with an aesthetic. And the Puritans, of course, had a very different sensibility around balance and beauty and where you discover God. You discover God in penance and sacrifice. And the Zen tradition would be you discover God in the beauty of and balance of the natural world and the artistic world. So I think there are some cultural differences, there are some philosophical differences. Starting from the Transcendentalists, the East and the Western schools of thought started to get merged. Emerson and his buddies up in Concord, Margaret Fuller and Henry David Thoreau and all the other guys up there, and women, Elizabeth Peabody, they were reading early translations of Eastern works. And they started to incorporate it in their writings, in their poetry. Emerson's Oversoul is very similar to Eastern ideas of consciousness, because he was talking about a universal sense of knowing and awareness that guided, that revealed wisdom and goodness, which is very similar to the Eastern way of thinking about consciousness. So I think what we see in the Transcendentalists, who were hugely influential on American thought, was the beginning of what is now the East meets West movement in America.
No, I think that makes a lot of a lot of sense. So this Zanskar place is very remote. It's surrounded by very powerful countries. How did you get there? Like, I don't imagine they have commercial air travel. So how does one get to Zanskar?
Well, it's different now. When I went there, you have to really squint to picture this. But when I went there was no internet. No internet. You couldn't look up things. You couldn't Google things. There were no cell phones. It was back in the day when your phone had a cord that plugged into a wall. And I don't know how we ever met
And stayed at home.
stayed at home. How did you connect with people? How did we do that then? I have no idea. We did. So I had a paper map. It was it was a copy of an Indian issue army map with some concentric circles showing at different elevations and some dashed lines showing footpaths. There were no roads through Zanskar at the time. There is now. There was no electricity there. I went there. The only way to get there at the time was by bus from Srinagar, which is in Kashmir. Kashmir has become, it's seen a lot of conflict since, but in those days it was relatively peaceful. And you took a bus on a road that was, the kind of edged on these cliffs, and oftentimes trucks would fall off the cliffs. It was a precarious journey, but I took a bus. I took a bus halfway to Leh. There's sort of a road that goes from Srinagar directly east to Leh, which is the capital of Ladakh. Ladakh and Zanskar are part of this Buddhist section of this little finger of North India. And I started walking, and I walked south for a couple 100 miles, up and down, and crossed mountain paths and over rope bridges and crossing snow bridges on glaciers. And then I walked northeast again. So it was a couple months of going, sometimes sleeping outside, sometimes sleeping in caves. It was definitely cold, but it was summertime. And I met a lot of people who took me into their homes, and I'd work with them in the fields, or I'd go to their temples and go to ceremonies and prayer ceremonies and meditations, and just follow one adventure to the next.
That is magical and incredibly amazing that you were able to do that. When it comes to places like that, I've always found fascinating how much of in the West we have this kind of divide between there's spirituality and church and God and all this type of thing, and then there's kind of the rest of your life. In many of these Eastern traditions, and I find this particularly with Buddhism, that line is non-existent. It's all a part of life. Spirituality, it all is all blended together. It's an everyday thing that informs everything you do. What was the daily life like in Zanskar?
And that was a part of being there that was such a relief to me, because I felt like I didn't have to live in compartments. I didn't have these boxes of myself where this is my professional life, and this is my family life, and this is my spiritual life. And we have so many labels and boxes that for things that bleed into each other or are really different ways of looking at the one single event of our human life and the one single event of life, period, capital L. And what I found with the Zanskaris is that they gave me tremendous faith and hope because they were so happy. They laughed a lot. They teased each other. They were affectionate. They were rowdy. They lived with a harmony that wasn't it wasn't a kumbaya harmony, and it wasn't a like repressed, we're all wearing white and, can't look sideways harmony. They lived so deeply from the principles of cultivating compassion, understanding that karma means the law of cause and effect. It's basic physics. You set something in motion, and that momentum is going to continue until there are various circumstances that cause it to slow down. So everyone's very concerned about creating good karma, not creating bad karma. So you don't do mean things to people because you're going to suffer the consequences. You are generous with people. You see it with kids. They would always give the other kid the sweet or the best piece of food. They were rowdy, but they were also generous in a way that just came from their deep adherence to that sense that the good things that happen to us in life are for the benefit of all sentient beings. They aren't just for us personally, they're to really uplift everyone. And when you have everyone living according to that, the quality is really light. It's just, you feel like just thinking about them, I would walk and I would stay, I'd be invited into a family's home, and I felt so safe, so held, so easy. And when I left, I left. There were no big tears. There was no big guilt trip. Don't go. Or there was no kind of grasping after things I had. There was a flow that was extraordinary, and people were really happy. I had never experienced that. I grew up in an academic household, and it was fine, but it wasn't happy like that. I grew up in East Coast city in America. It wasn't meaningful like that. It didn't have that lightness of being. And so partly the reason why I wrote this book during the pandemic is, one, writing is an outlet for me. So my work was, I founded a nonprofit that teaches mindfulness in schools, and our schools were all virtual. We were teaching 70 classrooms a week virtually, reaching about 5,000 students during the year. And it was a really hard time in the schools. It was a really hard time for students. It was a really hard time for teachers. So myself and my organization were doing everything we could to try to support people. And I just was seeing so much, I don't know exactly depression, but people were kind of giving up. They were letting go. They were retreating. And I felt like, writing is a stress reliever for me. I love to write. I always have. And this was a story that I always felt I wanted to tell, but I never had an excuse to take the time. And during the pandemic, I just felt it was critical that people feel hope about the human race, that people feel it is possible to live in a way that's really great. We can do that as a human family. We actually can. And some people do it. So that's why I wrote the book.
No, that was so good that you asked that, because I was going to get to the whole reason behind that. So but now that you've covered that, we can move on to the other aspect that I wanted to talk about, which was the women's empowerment angle. And I wanted to find out how this journey, how that empowered you, and what, how that, affected your life from that aspect of it.
Yeah. I always, I was interesting because I was not really a card carrying feminist, even though I was around a lot of radical leftist feminists when I was in college in upstate New York. It was kind of a hotbed of radical women writers in the late 70s, early 80s. So I was certainly influenced by that. But I just felt like I wanted to be free. I wanted to find out what freedom meant. I didn't want to be restricted or inhibited by what people told me I couldn't do. And if that meant that I was doing things that women didn't do, so be it. I mean, I when I went to India on my own as a young woman, um, it wasn't unheard of, but generally women, it was a lot harder to travel as a woman alone. It's Asia, for the most part, is very much a man's world. But because it's so much a man's world, at that time when I was there in the early 80s, people looked after me. They really made sure that I was out of harm's way and safe. And fortunately, I always had very good experiences. But the empowerment was of feeling, of really pursuing what was most important to me without any limitation, and not listening to common sense, which is helpful when you're young because your brain isn't fully developed to sort of register the danger that my older self now registers. I didn't really register it. I wanted to see if I could walk the high mountains, and I did it. I wanted to see if I could walk through the challenges of my mind and understand what I was learning in meditation retreats. And I did it. And I did it not not with, I mean, I probably had a lot more strength than I thought at the time, but I didn't feel particularly strong and I didn't feel particularly brave. And I have a fear of heights. So some of the things were super challenging. We had to cross these glacial rivers, which are moving really, really fast. And you cross them, the bridges that they had there they were rope bridges, but they were actually made out of short twigs about 6 inches in length that were braided together and strung over this river. So there were moments that were physically just utterly terrifying. There were other moments when I felt like the arm of, I don't know, all I can say is like evil currents of wind. It used to be a place of a lot of sorcery and black magic. And sometimes I would feel things that were so uncomfortable, I would get up in the middle of the night and pack up my sleeping bag and just walk under the stars because I had to leave whatever place because it was so creepy. So there were a lot of challenges that I had to walk through. And I did it. I'm a woman, so I did it as a woman alone. And that is, you can do that without having to have a chip on your shoulder against the world. And I think that was part of the empowerment, that a lot of the accomplishments I had as a woman before that in the West came with, it was me against the patriarchy. So I had a big chip on my shoulder for some years. And when I was in Zanskar, it was me and the elements. And it was my love for insight, wisdom, compassion, transcending the negativity of my mind rather than me against the world. And I think that was just incredibly empowering and liberating because I didn't have to go against anything anymore. And when I don't know that if young women feel that so much these days, but certainly there are other marginalized populations that feel that, especially in our Western culture where there's so much acrimony, that you have to fight your way upstream. And when I was in Zanskar, it was more a sense of learning how to be in flow and be in harmony and be aligned with my higher aspirations rather than pushing against my lower ones, if that makes sense.
No, it definitely does. I was mindful of a conversation we had previously where you mentioned that in their culture, women can marry up to four men.
I know, it's awesome, isn't it?
I mean, honestly, like as an autistic dude, I would be happy to be husband number four, where it's just like I have to be a husband on like Wednesday nights. Like Wednesday's my day of the week. Like that sounds ideal. Like I could get into that system. But what was your observation of that? What was that like?
It was very easy. Oftentimes, a woman would marry her husband's brothers. And part of the reason why is because the Zanskaris are also nomads and traders. And so during wintertime, it's much easier to travel because the rivers freeze. So they take their horses and they go along the frozen rivers and they'd go as far as Turkey. They were amazing traders. So if your husband's gone for 3, 4, 5, 6 months, it's hard. It's a hard life. There's a lot to do. You've got the animals, you've got your fields, you've got the children. So it became, I think it came out of a matter of convenience, but I never felt any tensions. And I did stay with some people where there were two husbands who were both there at the same time, but everyone was happy. It was all it all worked. There's enough space there, and there's enough detachment, and there's enough care for other people's well-being. You put other people's well-being first, not in a self-sacrificing way, but because we're all connected. Our well-being is profoundly and intricately interwoven. You can't really separate my well-being from your well-being. So the way they live together is a way that makes everyone happy.
Yeah, I've been studying this as part of a new theory I've been working on called individual collectivism, which is the idea that collectivism didn't work, hyper individualism didn't work. We actually need both. And when I was explaining this theory, someone's like, "Oh yeah, it's the net of Indra," which is a Hindu concept. And I said, "Yeah, no, the East has this figured out. I'm the one over here trying to tell the West to get it together." Um, so yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So keeping on this whole kind of idea and angle, what was the adjustment like after you left this area? What was it like to come back to the West? And how was your adjustment back into Western society?
Well, I spent the better part of 4 years in India. So I came and I was there for 15 months. I came back for 3 months. I went back for another 8 or 9 months. I came back to the West for a few months. I went back again. So for the better part of 4 years, I was in different parts of North India because I really loved being there. I felt that I could be myself in a way that I found very difficult in the West. I just felt that I didn't really fit in a certain way. And eventually, when I did come back to the West, I ended up being one of the founding members of a meditation center, residential meditation center. So I didn't really leave that life for the next 27 years until I moved to Philadelphia and founded a nonprofit that worked in the public school system, which is about as embedded in American dysfunctional culture as you can get. But I feel like the West now the West and East are less different than they were then. And unfortunately, we have exported our ways of being through the internet, through television, also through music. And what we've exported hasn't brought out the best in people. It's made people feel less than, not cherish the depth of their culture, seek for material. There's nothing wrong with material comfort, and there are a lot of innovations certainly that can help people who have lived very physically demanding lives or in poverty. But what we've exported has been not the best of the West, but the most, the shiny baubles on top of things. And it's created less difference between East and West, but more emptiness. So I found that in my lifetime, I went to Asia in 1983. It's 2022 now. I've seen that Westernization and materialization happen, and I've seen the impact of it. And it hasn't brought out the best, I'm sorry to say.
No, I think that's a common idea, and that dialectical materialism and being into the stuff and the lifestyle and all this type of thing. It is, yeah, that's we have exported that all around the world, but we have I think we've shared that aspect of who we are, but we haven't shared, like in this country, the spirit of giving or the spirit of volunteerism, all those kind of wonderful qualities that we rely on to help our society function. We
Right,
don't manage to seem to export those.
No, and the spirit of self-actualization. Obviously it's complicated because, America, England, Spain, Belgium, Portugal all have this terrible colonial past. And, that's something that I think is on the forefront of people's minds and of our social movement now, to figure out how can we address, some very serious wrongdoing at the onset of our culture, and somehow come to a higher integration with some aspects of self-actualization and working with science, working with the mind, and other things that have have been invented or worked on or deepened during those times. So we're living in a moment of transition where we're not sure where we're going to come out on the other side, but there's just simply a lot of work to do right now.
Yes, and I think we're, especially in this country, we're in an odd spiritual moment. The biggest religious group in America is the nuns, people who are just kind of leaving religion, traditional paths behind in favor of nothing and not much. Europe went through something similar in the 1930s and 40s. Do you think that this cultural exchange between East and West can give us that piece of inner fulfillment that we're missing in the West? We have enough yoga studios for it, for certain.
We sure do. I don't know. We need enough people who have gone deeply enough to keep the conversation at a level that is inspiring, that really catalyzes that experience, that human beings can live in a really different way in a way that provides profound joy, even in the midst of life's ups and downs, that can carry us through times of war like we're seeing now. And we're going to face really hard times as a human species. Climate change, it's not going away. The effects of systemic racism are not going to be ameliorated easily or quickly. And there's going to be a lot of rough edges, and we're going to have to be very mature around our emotions, around all of it, and deal with complexity. And if we have enough people doing that, I do think that we can, the mix of East and West can really lead to a way of really a different order of coexistence on the planet, which we're not seeing right now. We're really seeing a lot of breakdown. I don't think that breakdown is the end, but I do think that we need to be very mature and cultivate our inner fires, our realization, our heartfulness, our sense of profound interconnection, our sense of inherent human goodness, inherent goodness in the life force and the life principle, in order to be steady. Because I do think that we're just in for, let's be grown-ups about it. We're going to be in for difficulty right now. And we need to recognize that now and fortify ourselves through our own practice, through our own questioning. Like you were saying, oh, well, you're looking at the individual and the collective. Well, what does it mean to come to a higher order of a collective? Because we are a collective, and yet the pathway of that collective is going to be shaped by individuals who have deep vision and deep passion and a real sense for what's possible for life on Earth. But that's going to take a lot of steadiness. But if you look at the great heroes of our time, I mean, Nelson Mandela emerged from 27 years on Robben Island, 27 years of imprisonment, without malice in his heart. So it's possible. We have living examples of people who have done that in our own lifetime. And some of your listeners may be younger than I am, but more or less in our lifetime, not 2,500 years ago. But we all need to aspire to do that, because we've got, 8 billion people on the planet, and there aren't that many who are living at that level.
Yeah, I mean, we see, new examples of people, bearing up under tremendous circumstances. We see the people who, lost people in mass shootings, or people like Chelsea Manning or Edward Snowden, or this type of thing, who, are able to go through, really terrible things that would break most people, and manage to, survive that and not get lost in anger. And that is quite impressive. Speaking of that, though, we've been living in tough times. We have this war in Ukraine, of course. How has this spiritual practice helped you in the 2 years of the pandemic? Because I am leery. I tell people, I said, I would have never survived World War II. 2 years in, I'm done. So how have you borne up under the pandemic, and how's your practices helped you?
Yeah, I mean, I've been very fortunate. I have not gotten sick. I've also been careful. My husband hasn't gotten sick. While I know people who have passed from COVID, and I all around me in the schools, the students I work with, their families, the teachers, there's been a lot of suffering, economic suffering. But personally, I've been fine. I've done a lot of long retreat. So being home, being quiet, not doing that much, meditating, reading, has been fine for me. So I have to say that that's been my meditation practice that I've been doing since 1978 has been with me, and has helped me not feel hopeless or overly fearful or overly reckless. I have friends and family who've been both sides of it, too fearful to do anything, so that they were just living in, a sense of panic, or too reckless, so they ended up getting sick and getting their whole family sick. So I've just gone the middle way. And I think what has been hardest for me is seeing a lot of suffering in the city where I live, seeing a lot more crime in the city where I live. The last 2 years, there have been the most deaths and injuries from gun violence that the city has seen since the 70s. And that's been really painful. It's been really hard to see the city degrade. And I feel that America doesn't really get that the lack of investment in education and infrastructure since the 60s, really, when we had that great race to space, and the government was pouring money into education and into public works, really trying to, because a literate and talented population was what we needed to get the inventors and to get that X factor. We haven't seen that for decades, and our whole it shows. Our country is fraying, and I find that that was the hardest for me. But my practice has definitely kept me steady and able to continually draw from that well of that which is, always good, always, it's like the screen is always there no matter what movie is playing. Because when you say, you tap into that wellspring of goodness, people feel that you're not empathetic to suffering, but it's really quite the opposite. When you're able to recognize what is the substrate of life, it gives you the wherewithal to both feel more for suffering, to empathize, to care, to want to help, but also to be able to bounce back. So to not take on the burden in a way that creates burnout. And that's really important. I know people want to help a lot. People are very generous, but burnout is real. And that in the end is not going to be supportive of where we need to move to.
No, I definitely, I definitely see that within our society. I've been sort of, I grew up evangelical, and then I left that. Well, I didn't leave that behind. I was kicked out. And and then I spent a lot of my 20s in therapy for trauma and all this type of thing, and doing spiritual work in the Western esoteric tradition, all this sort of thing. And as I've kind of gotten into my 30s, I've kind of, taken a break from all of that. And I have a lot of people in my life that are kind of like, you really need, something, a faith, a spiritual path. I've even had a couple, spiritual people be kind of, you're without something to frame your life, someone like you is really dangerous, sort of thing. Um, and so I guess my next kind of question is, what does, in terms of moving through our complicated and dangerous society, how does your spiritual path anchor your life, and what do you think that can do for people? I'm mindful of crime. My car was broken into last week. I just got it back Monday. So we're also having the crime here in Seattle. And so how does your spiritual path, how can that help people bring a little bit of Zanskar into their everyday life?
That's great. I mean, I don't try to impose what works for me on other people. What I try to do is share what works for me to give people the inspiration to find out what works for them. To know, to feel that there is a there is somewhere to get to, there is something worth seeking for. But I can imagine, when you described your experience, I've certainly seen many paths gone wrong, more than have gone right. So I understand that kind of imposition on others. And, Viktor Frankl said that the difference between those who made it out of the concentration camps in World War II, who weren't broken, or even who came out alive, they had a sense of meaning. They had a sense of something worth living for, of a greater purpose. And whether that greater purpose was to care for a child, or to reunite with family, or to keep a tradition alive, or to end, barbarism among the human family. It didn't have to be the hugest purpose, but it had to be something that was good for self and good for others, whether it was in one's own sphere or in a larger sphere. And when we recognize that that is really what keeps us going, that human beings are really wired towards meaning, they're wired towards goodness, they're wired towards positivity, then it helps people value the small movements in their lives towards that. I've done lots of different intensive meditation practices and various different traditions and other and other kinds of personal transformation work. I don't teach any of that specifically at this point. I do teach people meditation. Of course, I teach my students different basic meditation, the teenagers I work with, basic meditation techniques. But I think because of the reasons that you alluded to, I'm cautious about prescribing anything. But I just want to encourage people, if you've had that fluttering in your heart and that sense that there's a numinous reality, that consciousness, that sense of the infinite nature of awareness is something closer than close. It's very much home. And that when you, whether that glimpse is a crack or it's like the pearly gates opening and the trumpets blaring, it doesn't really matter, because the tiniest glimpse of infinity is still infinite. You can't quantify infinity. You can't quantify a numinous awakening, an experience that gives you that sense of wholeness and oneness and non-separation and goodness. You can't quantify that. You can't measure that. And once you've had a taste of that, that's enough. You can live from it. You don't have to have huge experiences to have it be enough. And that's really what I try to share with people, so that people don't feel less than, it's always moving to be around noble people. It's inspiring. It's inspiring to be around people who really live from that. But if we can find those moments in our own life and cherish them and recognize that we've had that experience, whether it was walking out on a sunny day and for no reason at all, our hearts lit up and we just felt happy and we said, what happened? Nothing happened. I'm the same person who woke up yesterday, but today something touched me and I can feel goodness. Or, a lot of grandparents have it when they see their grandchild, or parents have that. Or, there are so many ways that we stumble into this sense of profundity. And if we cherish those small moments, it's enough to live from. And when we live from that, we don't feel like we're missing anything.
That is amazing. I feel that right in my chest. That is, I think, something we all could use in this time, especially with, potentially World War III on our doorstep. So I appreciate that. Well, we've come to that part of the show where we do our plugs. So why don't you let us know where people can find you online, where they can find the book, and how they can connect with you?
Of course. So you can find me online at amyedelstein.com. You can also find my nonprofit at innerstrengtheducation.org. And we have a lot of free tools for teens, including a free mobile app, absolutely no paywall, designed for teens, which is called Inner Strength Vibe, which you can get VIBE, which you can get on the App Store and Google Play for the teens in your life. I know some adults who use it, but it really is designed for teens. An Adventure in Zanskar is available at bookstores through Ingram Distributors. So you want to get it from your local bookstore, ask them to order it. They certainly can. It's also available on Amazon. And I really encourage you to pick it up. It's a fun travelogue. It's cultural commentary. It's a window into a world that is very different than ours. And from what I've heard, whether it's from my 20-year-old readers, or I have a 90-year-old reader who keeps sending me emails every day from the UK, just telling me just how inspired she is. So it seems to span different generations, and I hope you really enjoy it.
Well, thank you so much, Amy, for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast. I appreciate you.
All right. Thank you so much.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.